Rough hands close around your arms like iron. The air smells of ash and blood. Your village burns behind you, collapsing into itself with sounds like breaking bones. They drag you toward the water where dark ships wait. The rope cuts into your wrists. Someone screams your name, but the sound dies under the roar of flames. Cold sea water soaks through your dress as they pull you aboard. You try to remember your mother's face, but already it blurs. A boot shoves you down among the cargo. You are 17. You are no longer a person. You are merchandise now. This was reality for countless women across 3 centuries. From 793, when Lindisfarne burned until the final raids, Norse warriors swept across Europe's coasts. The Vikings did not sail thousands of miles merely for silver or land. They came for people. Specifically, they came for women. Young women and girls represented the most valuable plunder a raid could secure. More portable than gold, more profitable than livestock, and endlessly renewable through further expeditions. The British Isles, the Frankish coast, Iberia, Eastern Europe, all felt the same systematic extraction. What happened to these women after capture was not a byproduct of conquest. It was the business model itself, and it ran with ruthless efficiency for 300 years. Viking raids followed a pattern that repeated across continents and decades. Warriors did not simply sail out and attack whatever they encountered. They scouted, they planned, they chose targets specifically designed to maximize captives while minimizing resistance. Coastal monasteries topped the list of ideal locations. Monks could not fight back. Yet villages clustered near these religious centers for protection, creating dense populations of vulnerable people. Women and children sheltered there during times of danger. The raiders knew this. They also timed their attacks with calculated precision. Summer months found men working fields far from settlements. Dawn raids caught communities still sleeping, unable to organize defense. The window between first alarm and total control often lasted less than an hour. When the ships beat, raiders moved with practiced efficiency. Young women and girls were immediately separated from the general chaos. Age mattered. Those between roughly 12 and 25 held the highest value. Elderly women were killed outright, small children too. They offered no economic return. Mothers who resisted met the same fate and often cut down in front of their daughters. This served dual purposes: elimination of resistance and psychological breaking of captives. The Irish annals document raid after raid with chilling consistency. In 821, warriors struck Wexford and carried away a great prey of women. In 836, Frisia lost countless maidens to Norse ships. Year after year, the records repeat the same phrase: women taken, women seized, women as plunder. The binding process began immediately. Leather thongs secured wrists behind backs. Iron collars linked multiple captives in chains. Rope connected them in long lines to prevent individual escape attempts. Then came the march to the coast. These forced marches sometimes covered 20 or 30 m. Captives received no food. Water was minimal, and those who collapsed from exhaustion were abandoned or killed on the spot, slowing the group endangered profits. The captives spoke only Norse. Their captives understood nothing. This linguistic isolation was itself a weapon, severing any possibility of communication or plea. When the captives reached the ships, a new horror began. They were packed into open holes designed for cargo, not human transport. 20 to 40 women might be crammed into a vessel barely 60 ft long. Warriors and stolen goods filled the remaining space. There was nowhere to move, nowhere to lie down properly. The first night aboard ship stripped away any remaining illusions. Escape was impossible. Home was already beyond reach, and the journey had only just begun. The crossing to Scandinavia or Ireland could last anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. His every hour of that voyage was designed to break the human spirit. The long ships had no shelter. Open holes exposed captives to North Atlantic weather without mercy. Rain soaked through clothing that never dried. Salt spray burned eyes and throats. At night, temperatures plummeted. Women huddled together for warmth, but the cold penetrated regardless. The ships rolled and pitched constantly. Seasickness became universal within hours, but there was no space to move, no ability to lean over the side. Women vomited where they sat, creating conditions that grew more foul with each passing day. The stench became unbearable. Food consisted of scraps thrown like feeding animals, dried fish, stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. Water was rationed to the bare minimum required to keep captives alive. Dehydration caused lips to crack and bleed. His hands remained bound throughout the entire journey. This prevented any attempt to escape by drowning, a fate many preferred. Warriors watched constantly. The captives were property now, valuable cargo to be delivered to market, but they were also available. The men used them as they wished during the voyage. Resistance meant being struck unconscious or thrown overboard. Children learned quickly that survival meant complete submission. Irish monastic chronicles from the period describe women arriving at Dublin broken in body and spirit. That was not accidental. The voyage itself served as conditioning, preparing captives for what awaited. Mortality during transport ran high. Perhaps 1 in 4 or 5 died before reaching land. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Injuries grew infected. The weak simply gave out. These bodies were tossed into the sea without ceremony. Damaged goods had no value. When ships finally reached their destination, survivors faced a new ordeal. They were washed and their wounds superficially treated, not from compassion. Healthy looking merchandise commanded better prices. Then came the waiting and holding pens near the harbor. Market day approached, and with it, the next phase of nightmare. Slavery was not peripheral to Viking economy. It was the foundation. Conservative estimates suggest tens of thousands of women were trafficked annually during the peak decades. This was not hidden or shameful to Norse society. It happened openly in major trading centers that functioned as clearing houses for human cargo. Dublin stood as the western hub of this network. Norse warriors established it in 841, specifically as a trading port. By the 900s, it had grown into Europe's largest market outside Constantinople. The layout was brutally practical, holding pens clustered near the harbor, where ships unloaded their captives. Auction blocks dominated the market square. Irish chronicles refer to the sorrow of Dublin's markets, a phrase that specifically meant the auctions. Women captured from Scotland, Wales, England, and Ireland all flowed through this single point. Some were sold to Norse settlers establishing farms across Ireland. Others were re-exported. Ships carried them to Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, or back east to Scandinavia itself. Habibi served as the continental gateway. Located on the modern border between Denmark and Germany, it sat at the crossroads between North Sea and Baltic trade routes. Here women from western raids mixed with Slavic captives taken from the east. The market functioned as a redistribution point where merchants sorted captives by age, appearance, and perceived skills. But the longest and most profitable route ran east. Birka in Sweden and Novgorod in what is now Russia opened the door to the Volga trade network. This was where distances became almost incomprehensible. A woman seized from a village in Ireland could be transported over 0 miles to end up in Baghdad. The journey involved multiple stages and multiple sales. Each merchant along the chain took his profit. A single captive might be bought and sold 4 or 5 times before reaching her final destination. Arab silver drove this entire system. As the Islamic world's enormous demand for slaves made the eastern route extraordinarily profitable, the market experience itself was dehumanizing by design. On auction day, captives were displayed in rows for inspection. Buyers examined teeth like checking horses. They studied hands for calluses that might indicate useful skills. They assessed bodies with clinical detachment. Age mattered most. Women between 14 and 25 commanded the highest prices. Appearance affected value. Perceived virginity increased worth. Any visible defects dropped the price immediately. Some captives were permanently branded or tattooed to mark ownership and prevent escape. Language barriers added another layer of horror. Most captives never understood what was being said about them. Yet they could not comprehend the negotiations that determined their fate. Mothers were deliberately separated from children. This reduced resistance and increased profit. Children could be sold separately or kept to raise as thralls from birth. Historical records preserve some price information. A young healthy woman might sell for 12 silver dirhams that equaled the value of a good horse or a small farm. Beautiful or highborn women could command 30 to 40 dirhams. Pregnant women sold at discount. They represented liability rather than immediate utility. Children under 10 held minimal value unless noble-born and suitable for ransom. The Old Norse word for slave was thrown thr, but the more revealing term was fey, meaning both cattle and wealth. Norse law codes classified thralls explicitly as property, not people, as they appeared in legal texts alongside livestock and estate inventories. This was not metaphor, it was legal fact. A thrall possessed zero rights under law. She could not testify in disputes. She could not own property. She could not enter legal marriage. She could not seek protection from abuse. Her master's authority was absolute. The Groggas, Iceland's medieval law collection, states plainly that a thr's oath is worth nothing. A master could beat, use, or end a thr's life without facing legal consequence. This was simply the exercise of property rights. The workload assigned to thrall women was designed to extract maximum value while their bodies could still function. The day began before dawn and ended long after dark. Grain grinding consumed hours each day. The cornstones were heavy as the work destroyed joints and wore teeth down to stumps. Water carrying meant multiple trips daily from streams or wells. Wooden buckets were heavy even before filling. Textile production formed the backbone of thrall labor and the Norse economy itself. Every garment worn, every sail that moved a ship came from wool processed by thrall hands. Shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving. The production of a single wool cloak required over 200 hours of work. Thrall women produced all clothing for households that might number 15 to 30 people. Food preparation for these large households meant cooking over open fires for hours. Cleaning involved ash removal, floor scrubbing, and waste disposal. All of it fell to thralls. Outdoor labor included tending animals, maintaining gardens, and processing fish. Yet the work never stopped, and the seasons offered no relief. Even a thr's appearance marked her status. She wore rough, undyed wadam, the coarsest grade of wool. Often she went barefoot, even during winter months. Iron collars were common, visible symbols of bondage. Hair was shorn short or left deliberately unkempt. This contrasted sharply with free women who wore brooches, colored dresses, and proper head coverings. Food rations consisted of leftovers and scraps. Historical sources describe thralls receiving the bones from the master's table. Chronic malnutrition was universal. Children born into slavery showed stunted growth. Adults suffered deficiencies that weakened bones and rotted teeth. Sleeping quarters were corners of barns, storage areas, or sometimes animal pens. There was no privacy, no personal space. In winter, his heating was inadequate and blankets thin. Bodies deteriorated rapidly under these conditions. The average lifespan of a thrall was perhaps 30 to 35 years. Free persons of the same era lived to 50 or even 55. Thralls simply wore out. Chronic pain from damaged joints and injured backs became constant companions. Respiratory diseases flourished and smoke filled living spaces. dental decay progressed unchecked. No medical care existed for thralls. If a THRL became too injured or sick to work, she was often abandoned. A useless tool had no value. Some masters freed elderly thralls rather than continue feeding them. This was presented as mercy. In reality, it was cost-cutting. A freed thrall too old to work faced starvation outside the household that had consumed her youth. Yes, the physical evidence supports every detail of this grim picture. Studies of skeletal remains from the period show that those buried with minimal goods, likely thralls, display clear markers of hard labor and poor nutrition. Bones show stress fractures and joint damage, consistent with years of grinding grain and carrying heavy loads. Teeth are worn down from both diet and the constant consumption of bread, contaminated with stone dust from corns. This was not merely loss of freedom. It was the systematic destruction of human beings for economic gain. And for women classified as THRS, the exploitation reached beyond labor into realms even darker. The Old Norse language had a specific word for concubine. Freya, this was not a hidden shame. It was an open institution woven into household structure. A master's physical access to his female THRS was considered a natural right of ownership. Her body was his property, just as surely as her labor. There was no concept of consent because consent requires personhood. Under Norse law, thralls were not persons. The household dynamics this created were complex and brutal. Many Norse homes contained multiple THRL women alongside the legal wife called husfrøya. The master could and did use these women as he wished. The legal wife held no power to stop this. She could only redirect her anger downward toward the thralls themselves. Jealousy and resentment turned wives into tormentors. Thrall women found themselves caught between the master's demands and the wife's rage. Resistance to either brought punishment. Compliance with the master earned the wife's cruelty, as there was no winning position. The children born from these forced unions occupied uncertain legal ground. Norse called them thronebarn, literally THR, woman's child. Their status depended entirely on their father's decision. He could acknowledge the child and grant freedom. This happened rarely. More commonly, the child inherited the mother's enslaved status. This created a self-sustaining system. Households could breed their own THRL labor without conducting raids. Some estates deliberately maintained populations of thralls across generations. The sagas written centuries later mentioned these arrangements with casual acceptance. In Lax D Saga, the character Melkorka appears as an Irish princess captured in raids. Legend claims her captors cut out her tongue. Yet, the chieftain Huskr Dala Karlsson purchased her in Norway and brought her to Iceland as his concubine. She bore his favorite son, Olaf the Peacock. Despite royal birth and mothering an important heir, Melkorka remained property throughout her life. She never regained freedom. She died in bondage. The sagas present this not as tragedy, but as background detail. Highborn captives made prestigious concubines. That was simply how things worked. The genetic legacy of this systematic coercion remains visible today. Studies of Icelandic DNA reveal a striking pattern. The founding population carried roughly 80% Norse male lineage, but over 60% of maternal lineages trace back to the British Isles, primarily Ireland and Scotland. These were not voluntary partnerships, since Iceland was settled during the height of Viking raiding in those exact regions. The women did not immigrate. They were cargo. Every modern Icelander with Celtic maternal ancestry likely descends from an enslaved woman forced across the North Atlantic. Her suffering echoes in the genes of millions. This was not exceptional behavior by a few cruel individuals. It was systematic practice across Norse society. The majority of female thralls experienced this exploitation repeatedly throughout their bondage. It was built into the structure of the household. It was normalized across the entire culture and it went unquestioned in every surviving source the Vikings themselves created. To them, this was simply the proper use of property. The women had no voice. History recorded their master's perspective. Their own experience vanished into silence. Freedom existed, but only as the narrowest of paths. The Norse had a word for the act of freeing a thrfi. It happened, but it was extraordinarily rare. Masters freed thralls for specific reasons, none of them humanitarian. Deathbed conscience drove some decisions. A dying man might grant freedom in his will, hoping to secure favor with the Christian God. This became slightly more common after conversion, but remained unusual. Exceptional service over decades sometimes earned freedom. 20 or 30 years of perfect obedience might convince a master to release an aging thr. This was reward, yes, but it came only after youth and health had been consumed entirely. Powerful men occasionally freed thralls as political gestures. Displaying magnanimity enhanced reputation among peers. The thr's decades of suffering became a tool for the master's social advancement. The process required public ceremony with witnesses. Legal documents had to be prepared. Even after gaining technical freedom, the former thrl entered a new category called lengi. This status carried its own chains. Lengi owed continued loyalty and service to the former master's family. They held limited property rights. Their children remained tainted by servile origins for generations. Marriage prospects were minimal. Its social mobility was nearly impossible. The Horning runestone in Denmark commemorates a man named Toki who was freed by his master. Such stones are rare. They exist because manumission was noteworthy, not because it was common. Scholars estimate perhaps 1 or 2% of thralls ever achieved even this compromised freedom. For high-value captives, ransom offered the only real hope of return. Princesses, daughters of nobles, and aeses had families with resources. But the ransom process could drag on for months or years. During that time, captors sometimes brutalized highborn captives deliberately. Visible suffering encouraged families to pay faster. The Anglo-Saxon sources mentioned several such cases. In the 920s, a daughter of Athelade of Mercia was held for ransom. That various Irish princesses passed through the Dublin markets with prices set for their return. But ransom required 3 things: family still alive, family willing to pay, and the ability to locate the captive in the first place. Most women had none of these. For some, death became the only escape they could control. Historical sources mention women who drowned themselves when opportunity arose. Others refused food until their bodies gave out. These attempts, when discovered, brought brutal punishment designed to deter others. But some succeeded. For them, death was freedom. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia during the 10th and 11th centuries, the Church officially opposed enslaving fellow Christians. The reality was far more complex. Change came slowly and incompletely. Some thralls were freed when their masters converted. Most were not. More commonly, the Church accepted existing bondage while encouraging masters toward kindness. This changed nothing fundamental. Legal loopholes remained wide open. Christians could still enslave pagans. Slavic peoples and Baltic tribes remained fair targets well into the medieval period. The institution did not end. It simply shifted its focus to new victims. Viking Age slavery did not end because Norse society developed moral conscience. It faded because economic and political structures shifted beneath it. Christianity's spread altered legal frameworks, but not from compassion. Church law prohibited enslaving fellow Christians. This did not mean the Church opposed bondage itself. It meant enslaving the wrong people became illegal. Pagans, Muslims, and those deemed heretics remained acceptable targets. If the slave trade continued, only the sources of supply changed. The consolidation of royal power undermined the raiding economy more effectively than any religious teaching. During the 10th and 11th centuries, strong kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason centralized control over Scandinavia. These rulers wanted tax revenue flowing to royal coffers. Independent warlords enriching themselves through raids represented competition. Kings redefined raiding as piracy, an illegal act rather than entrepreneurial venture. This reduced the frequency of large-scale expeditions. Over time, economic transformations reshaped the entire region. By the late 11th century, the Volga trade route had declined significantly. The Islamic Caliphate fragmented into smaller states with less purchasing power and stability. Mediterranean trade grew in importance, but Byzantine and Italian merchants controlled those networks. Norse traders found themselves cut out of the most profitable markets. Agricultural intensification across Scandinavia reduced the desperate need for mass thrall labor. Better farming techniques and tools meant free farmers could work their land more efficiently. Large thrall populations became less essential to economic survival. The cost of feeding and housing thralls began to outweigh their value in some contexts. But slavery did not vanish. It transformed into something else. Medieval serfdom bound peasants to land rather than to individual masters. The chains looked different but remained coercive. Former thralls became serfs in many cases. They traded one form of bondage for another slightly less absolute. By the year 1200, illegal slavery had become rare in Scandinavia. Unfree laborers still worked the fields. The language changed, the fundamental exploitation continued. The Baltic Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries provided new justification for bondage. Christian warriors enslaved pagan Balts and Slavs in the name of conversion. Norse markets operated into the 13th century, still trading human beings. Small-scale trafficking persisted well into the late medieval period. The industrial-scale operations of the Viking Age ended around 1100, but the practice itself proved harder to kill. The Vikings left no records expressing guilt or shame about any of this. Sagas written 2 or 3 centuries after the height of raiding still mention thralls with complete casualness. No Norse text questions the morality of owning people. In later, Scandinavian historians actively sanitized this aspect of their past. 19th and 20th century, nationalism presented Vikings as heroes, explorers, and symbols of Nordic superiority. The slavery was minimized, ignored, or explained away as different from other forms of bondage. This deliberate historical amnesia persists today in popular culture. This was not an aberration. It was a system designed and maintained across 3 centuries. It shows how easily human societies normalized the dehumanization of others. Economic incentives consistently overrode moral considerations throughout the Viking Age. The men who conducted these raids did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as businessmen, traders, and providers for their families. They were sophisticated navigators who calculated tides and winds. As they were skilled craftsmen who built ships that remain engineering marvels. They were poets who created literature that still resonates. And they were slavers who treated human beings as inventory. These facts coexist. The numbers will never be fully known. Conservative estimates suggest 200 to 500 women were enslaved across the Viking Age. Some scholars argue the figure exceeds 1 million. Each number represents a name forgotten, a life destroyed, a family line severed. Most died in bondage. They have no graves, no markers, no memorials. History erased them. We have Viking perspectives preserved in sagas. We have Arab merchant accounts from travelers like Ibn Flann. We have Irish monastic chronicles recording raid after raid. We do not have the voices of the women themselves. History was written by everyone except those who suffered most. Their stories survive only in gaps and silences. The genetic traces they left behind speak louder than any document. Modern implications extend beyond academic history. Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Orkney, and the Hebs were all founded substantially on captive labor and forced unions. DNA studies reveal millions of modern descendants carry this history in their cells. You cannot celebrate Viking heritage without acknowledging the foundation it rests upon. The long ships that inspire awe were crewed by men who filled their holds with human cargo. The explorers who discovered new lands brought women in chains to settle them. This history offers an uncomfortable mirror. Viking Age slavery lasted 300 years, yet the Atlantic trade in African people lasted 400 years. Human trafficking exists today with an estimated 50 million people in various forms of bondage globally. The capacity for systematic exploitation has not disappeared from human nature. We are not examining ancient monsters from a completely foreign world. We are examining patterns that repeat. For every Viking explorer or warrior celebrated in museums and media, there were dozens of women whose suffering funded that glory. Their labor wove the sails that carried ships across oceans. Their bodies bore the children who populated new settlements. Their silent anguish built an empire that still shapes northern Europe. The girl dragged aboard that ship at 17. Her name is forgotten, but she was real. She felt the rope cutting her wrists. She smelled the smoke of her burning village. She endured the voyage and the market and the years of grinding labor. She bore children who inherited her chains. And she died without ever seeing home again. What happened to her was not adventure or cultural difference. It was atrocity, systematic and sustained. This is the history no saga recorded and no runestone commemorates. But it deserves to be remembered with absolute clarity. The Vikings did not raid merely for silver or land. They raided for people, for women. And what they did afterward was too brutal for 3 centuries of their own literature to honestly confront. That truth stands regardless of how much time has passed.